Hey, well, welcome everyone again. We're so glad you could join us. My name is Lee Ashoff. I'm an admissions advisor at Pacifica. I wanted to just give you a few updates for your benefit before we start the call. We are now accepting applications for spring 2019. There's an early admission deadline, which is February 1st. If you submit your application by that date, you qualify for a free certificate on Enchantivism, Changing the World with Story, Myth, and Inspiration. This certificate is an online 8-week course with Craig Chalquist, and it normally costs $600. So that is a way of us saying thank you for your early commitment. If you have a lot going on or aren't interested in that, the final application due date is March 11th, 2019. So those are important dates. Another good thing to know about is that at Pacifica we have what we call intro days, which are day-long campus visits, and these are amazing experiences for anyone interested in the DJA program or any program at all. You get to come to campus and get a feeling for what it's like. The co-founder of Pacifica, Steve Eisenstadt, gives a lecture on dream tending, which is very inspiring. And probably the most important part, in my opinion, is that you get to meet with faculty. So we have faculty from each of the programs there in person representing, so you can have an in-person conversation and ask questions and meet these scholars who have spent most of their lives studying this material, depth psychology, in all these different ways. Our next one is this Friday, January 18th, and soon we will be releasing the other dates. So a few things about the webinar. As you can probably tell, I have muted everybody that's a participant. So please keep yourself muted. Dr. Caroline Legrice will speak, and afterwards we'll have a question and answer. The way we'll do that is we will accept questions in the Zoom group chat window. So you can just write a question in there. I'll come back on and I will read the question, and Karen can go ahead and answer. So officially, welcome to the Archetypal Cosmology and Astrology, a New Frontier in Depth Psychology webinar. This is with Dr. Kieran Legrice. He is a professor of depth psychology and archetypal cosmology. He's chair of the Jungian and Archetypal Studies specialization at Pacifica. He teaches courses on archetypes, individuation, alchemy, synchronicity, and the history of depth psychology. He was educated at the University of Leeds, England, and the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. He is the author of 4 books: The Archetypal Cosmos, Discovering Eris, The Rebirth of the Hero, and Archetypal Reflections. He's co-editor of Jung on Astrology, which is a compilation of Jung's writings on the topic. He is the founder and former co-editor of Archive, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology. In 2016, he co-founded the Institute of Transpersonal and Archetypal Studies. And this is very exciting. His 2-part archetypal astrological analysis of Bruce Springsteen's song lyrics is housed in the Bruce Springsteen Special Collection in New Jersey. And recently he contributed an essay to Jung's Red Book for Our Times, published by Chiron. So getting to know a little bit about Dr. Caroline Legrice. Thank you so much, Kieran, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Lee. It's always strange to hear one's biography read out in that way, but it's a great introduction actually to the topic. Just let me get myself on speaker view if I can. Could you mute yourself, Lee, just for a second? Okay, well, that's not shifted my position on the screen, but I will proceed nonetheless. Well, hopefully you can all see me. It's unusually dark in California, and I don't have a overhead light in my office. So I've got various lamps positioned around the room, and hopefully there'll be enough light for you to see me as we go along. So the topic today is archetypal cosmology, which is a term you may not be familiar with. Astrology, presumably you're familiar in some sense with that. Many people know of Jung's interest in astrology, Carl Jung, as the main focus of the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program, we study extensively from Jung's collected works. And throughout those collected works, 18 volumes of writing, Jung, there are scattered references to astrology. In one of the books called Ion, he dedicates about 3 or 4 chapters to astrology, but mostly the kind of scattered references here and there. But Jung had an abiding interest in astrology right from the beginning of his career as a psychiatrist. In fact, one of the reasons he broke from Sigmund Freud was his interest in the occult. Freud didn't approve of Jung's investigations into topics such as astrology, and then later Jung got interested in alchemy too. So we're dealing here with subjects that fall outside of the normal paradigmatic boundaries of what is acceptable in the academic world and in intellectual discourse. But I think that's one of the reasons many of us are attracted to Jung's psychology. He probes deep into the human psyche, and he's not willing. He's very willing to engage with these topics that are being perhaps too hastily dismissed by modern science, modern thought. Jung was concerned very much with how we in the modern world find life meaning, how we've come to terms with the depths of the unconscious psyche. And in Jung's model of the psyche, the deepest layer of the unconscious he calls the collective unconscious, a dimension of the mind, of the psyche that we all share. And Jung believed that that is populated by archetypes. This, again, is a central focus of the program, Jungian and Archetypal Studies, right? So archetypes are among the most important concepts we study. Now, you might well all know of some Jungian archetypes. They've entered the common language, like the shadow, for example, the idea that there's a darker, inferior dimension to the human personality that kind of stands in opposition to and compensates for the light side, the conscious side of the personality. So there's the shadow, the anima and animus, the inner masculine and inner feminine, the hero. We're all familiar with the hero archetype in one way or another. And then the trickster, the great mother, the child, Dionysus, the wise old man, the archetype of the spirit more generally, and the self for Jung is the central archetype. It's different in meaning to when we normally use the word self. For Jung, the self is often written with a capital S, is more like the God part of it, the God within, the central organizing archetype. So archetypes are the main dynamisms and principles and powers in the human psyche in Jung's view. Now, I've been involved for several years, not only in studying Jung, but in studying astrology. In fact, it's been a long time interest of mine since I was about 16, 17, so a long time ago now. And what I find very helpful about astrology is that it posits and demonstrates a correlation between the positions of the planets in the solar system and the archetypes in the unconscious psyche. So this is a radical proposition by most standards and contradicts the assumptions that inform our worldview. But if you investigate astrology with any depth, you yourself might come to see and understand this correlation. And it can be very helpful because if you can work with astrology, you can understand by looking at the planetary positions as they move in their orbits, you can understand how the archetypes in the psyche change in relationship to each other. So, for example, the sun has much to do with the ego, the light of consciousness. The ego is the center of the field of consciousness in Jung's view. The sun is also connected to the hero archetype in the sense of the The hero is intentional consciousness, will, individualism. So each of the planets and the sun and the moon in the solar system are associated with these different principles. The moon is to do with the child archetype, and also the great mother, the mother-child relationship. Pluto, to pick one of the outer planets, Pluto is to do with rebirth, experiences of death, rebirth, but also instinctual empowerment and a kind of Dionysian passion for life, the passion that can sweep us along. I often think of Dionysus when, if you put on a piece of rock music, for example, and the emotion that's stirred by that music, that has a very Dionysian flavor, where you can feel kind of swept along by a greater emotional, instinctual power. So Pluto is to do with Dionysus. Saturn is connected to the Senex archetypes. The Senex is the Latin term for old. So Saturn is connected to the wise old man. It's wisdom, it's age, authority, maturity, but also death. Saturn is to do with death, endings, limitations, and connected to the shadow and moral judgment, inferiority. Uranus is connected to the trickster, to sudden, unpredictable change, the capacity of the psyche to disrupt, to overthrow, to flip things on their head. And then Neptune is to do with spiritual experience, dream, myth, image, illusions, ideals. So I'm sketching out very quickly the kind of archetypal pantheon. And each of these principles, each of these planets is consistently connected to the experience of an expression of these archetypes in human experience. So that is the central insight informing archetypal cosmology. Archetypal cosmology, I should explain, is the name that those of us working in this way, using astrology in this way, gave to the field. This discipline came out of the work of Richard Tarnas, who's a philosophical historian, a historian of culture too, and very interested in depth psychology. And he wrote an influential book called Cosmos and Psyche, which came out in 2006. And in that book, Tarnas demonstrates, by looking at the changing patterns of world history in terms of how the planets were related to each other at particular periods of history, he demonstrates this consistent correlation between how the planets move relative to each other when two planets are in alignment with each other, and corresponding themes that are evident in culture and history at the time. So that book really gave a kind of empirical footing to astrology in a way that had never happened before. And then as a consequence of that publication, the field of archetypal cosmology emerged. And so it draws extensively on Jung's work, as you can imagine. Jung, the foremost articulator of the idea of archetypes in the modern world, in the modern era. And it draws too on the work of James Hillman, who's another figure we study in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program here at Pacifica. Hillman was trained as a Jungian in Zurich, but then pioneered what he called archetypal psychology, which is consistent in many ways with Jung's psychology, but emphasizes even more this idea of a world soul, an anima mundi, the idea that archetypes and psyche, soul, pervade everything. And the psyche is not just the inner world and like the human mind inside the head. For Hillman and for Jung too, the psyche is like a field that's all around us, like an atmosphere in which we live, and so it's within the within of all things, and not just the within of the individual human being. So archetypal cosmology draws on both Jungian psychology and Hillman archetypal psychology, and then it extends the ideas of both of those, both Jung and Hillman, into the realm of cosmology. That's where the name came from, archetypal and cosmology, because it uses the cosmological patterns, and it uses astrology's methods of interpreting these patterns formed by the planets as they move on their orbits. It uses that to map the psyche. Astrology can be seen as a kind of archetypal map, using an external planetary frame of reference to understand the shifts that are happening within the depth of the psyche. And this can be used to understand cultural changes. It can be used to understand the basic pattern of the human personality. I'm sure you've all heard of birth chart readings. You know, you go to an astrologer, you give the astrologer your time of birth, your date of birth, your place of birth, and the astrologer can draw up a horoscope, a chart based on that information. And that chart shows where the planets are at the moment you're born. And then you can understand, by looking at the planetary relationships, you know, how is the Sun related to Saturn, or how is Saturn related to Pluto? You can look at that, use that information to understand how the archetypes associated with the Sun, with Pluto, with Saturn, how they are expressed and how they are related in your personality. So it's a kind of an archetypal reading of the dynamisms and major themes of one's personality. That's birth chart astrology. And then you can also look at what's happening in your own life over time. So you could look at where the planets are when you're 30 or 40 years old. You just have a book. There's a book like this. It's called an ephemeris, and it shows all the planetary positions. I'm not sure if you can see that. It shows all the planetary positions day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year. So if you know your astrology, you can track the positions of the planets, and you can use a knowledge of those positions to understand what's happening in your life in any given time period. Now, the information that's given in astrology is not specific. I think this is one of the major misconceptions of astrology, the idea that somehow you can go to an astrologer and they will tell you your future, you know, what kind of job you're going to have or who you might marry. You know, there's that kind of almost a connection to fortune telling that's there in the popular view of what astrology is. But an archetypal approach to astrology moves far away from that. It's not concerned with literal prediction of events that are going to happen. Rather, it's concerned with understanding the major archetypal themes, patterns, and dynamisms that are manifest in human experience. But if you can understand, if you can get a sense for what those themes are, that can add to your capacity to live more consciously. You're less likely to fall under be blinded by a particular archetype if you can look in your chart and see, wow, you know, the next 2-3 years, I know that I'm going to be entering a period where I'm going to be perhaps more reckless or more experimental, more daring or more extreme. And then you can be mindful of that when it happens in your experience, so you don't get unconsciously swept along by a particular drive. But that's one of the main insights of depth psychology, really, that there's the dimension of the psyche called the unconscious that can blind us, it can grab us, it can drive us compulsively and impel us to do things that we wouldn't consciously in our better judgment have chosen. And this can be a positive thing. You know, you can feel empowered by the heroic drive within us all. You know, one day you might feel that you're really tuned into the hero and you feel that you can take on the world and nothing's going to defeat you and you're willing to sacrifice everything to some goal. That's the hero archetype. You know, we tend to think of these archetypes as our own emotions. That, you know, I feel like I can do anything today. But Jung's insight is that these drives, these motifs and states of consciousness are not unique to you or to me. They're collective. Everyone experiences the heroic in some way, or everyone experiences the Dionysian urge to annihilate their consciousness and just merge back into a kind of primal instinctual divinity, or that's the depth of Dionysus. We all look for that in some way, often in warped ways or unconscious ways, but Jung's insight is that these are reflections of a collective psychology, like a collection of different almost gods and goddesses. Jung likened archetypes to gods and goddesses that intervene in human experience, that can possess us and stir in us powerful emotion. And astrology then is a way to understand how the gods and goddesses, if you like, are coming through. How are they manifest in your experience at a particular time? So it's very useful in that way to make the unconscious dimension of human life more conscious to us. We have this external map. Use the planetary positions to understand what's happening in the depths of the psyche archetypally. And it can also lend to the modern individual's life a greater sense of meaning. And if you feel that your individual experience is meaningfully connected to the universe and is not just arbitrary, it's not just random, your life is not just a random chance haphazard thing that you just happen to come into existence, but somehow what you're experiencing is connected to the whole and connected to all other people's experience through the archetypes. So I think astrology can be very helpful at giving that cosmological perspective and allowing us to live with a greater sense of a meaning beyond our own experience. We've all got our own life meanings. We want to make money, or get a comfortable lifestyle, and get married and have children and be happy, and so on. And these are very valuable, meaningful aims. But sometimes we crave more, and there's something in the human psyche that longs for connection to a greater order, to the numinous. Numinous is a term that Jung used to describe spiritual power, spiritual experience. And astrology gives us a way to understand the different kinds of numinous powers, the different kinds of archetypes that are coming through us. Now, in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program, there are a number of courses that address ideas very relevant to understanding astrology and archetypal cosmology. There's a course that's dedicated to archetypes called Archetypes, Universal Patterns of the Psyche. I sometimes teach that myself. And in that, you would study the history of archetypes, going back to Greek mythology, and then Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, all the way through to the modern era with figures like Immanuel Kant, and then German idealism with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and then the beginnings of psychology, and focusing especially, of course, on Jung. And that course also looks at how Jung's own understandings of archetypes evolved. And he moves from this idea of archetypes as being just within the psyche, intrapsychic, to a view of archetypes as what he calls psychoid, by which he means that archetypes are not just inside us, they also influence the world. If you have, I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of synchronicity. If you're absorbed in some particular problem in your life, you're at your wit's end, you don't know what you're going to do, you can't make a decision, and then suddenly you walk past a bookstore and pull out a book from the bookshelf, open it randomly, and right there on the page in front of you is just the information you were needing, just the insight you needed to resolve your problem. Or you turn on the TV and there's a talk show that's addressing that topic. These are what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, where it seems as if the world itself is conveying archetypal meaning to us. So Jung realized that archetypes can't just be psychological, they're also material. They're somehow embedded in the stuff of the world. They fall in line with physical material processes as well as being psychological. So that's what he meant by psychoid. So that course examines carefully how Jung's ideas on archetypes evolved, as well as looking at the nature of specific archetypes, anima and animus, trickster, wise old man, mother, and so forth. And then there's a dedicated course also on James Hillman. This is called Archetypal Psychology, the name of Hillman's approach to the field. That's taught by Glenn Slater, who's core faculty in the program, and that most of Hillman's major texts are covered in that course, including Revision in Psychology, which is perhaps the foundational text of Hillman's work. And again, with Hillman, you get this pervasive polytheism, the idea that there's not just one God, as the monotheism like Christianity maintain, but the psyche is populated by many gods and goddesses, in inverted commas, and they come through in everything we do. You know, Hillman once said, you can't even open your mouth without a God speaking. And that is indicative of just how pervasive these archetypal patterns are in human experience. So a dedicated course on Hillman, and Hillman really, one of his great contributions, I think, was to take depth psychology out of a kind of clinical focus. You know, you go to your therapist and you're concerned with your own inner growth and individuation. That's the classic analytical encounter. Hillman was concerned with how archetypes come through culturally, you know, in film, in music, in politics, in history, any field of human endeavor. And so there's this broader, rich cultural imagination that comes through with Hillman. And that informs archetypal astrology. Lee mentioned in the opening there that I'd done an analysis of Bruce Springsteen's music using astrology. And so that's an example of how you can look at the birth chart of a famous figure. It could be an artist or a performer or a writer or a thinker or an inventor, and see how, by looking at their chart in relation to their life and their life's work, you can see how these archetypal themes are coming through. And they always come through in creative ways. You will express Saturn, the Senex, the old, in a different way to me. Your shadow will be different to my shadow, even though we all have a shadow. So that's the archetypal part of it. We all have a shadow, but what is for you a cause of inferiority and embarrassment and shame is different to what causes that in me. So that's the specific difference. Richard Tarner summarized well astrology when he said that astrology is archetypally predictive, i.e. it reveals universal general themes, but it's not concretely predictive. So it can't tell you specifically what job you're going to do or you know, who you're going to marry or anything like that. So that's the shift I mentioned earlier from the more literal approach that has been prevalent in astrology for many years and still is in some approaches. A shift from that to a more psychologically sophisticated archetypal view. So that's James Hillman. There are other courses too that address themes very relevant to understanding archetypal astrology. There's a dedicated course on myth, depth psychology and myth, taught by Saffron Rossi, also core faculty in the program. And last year or year before, I co-edited a book with Saffron called Jung on Astrology. She too is very interested in the field, and that astrology really informs her own understanding of depth psychology and her own approach to myth. And we see this in Jung. Jung uses astrology when he's discussing mythic themes in various places through the collective works, and particularly in relation to alchemy. There's a very close connection between alchemy and astrology. And that's another course in the program, alchemy, which I tend to teach in the third year of the program. It's not, we don't look too much at astrology, but there's this historical connection between alchemy and astrology. The alchemists, the ancient alchemists, used astrology in the creation of their alchemical treatises. There's one particular alchemist called Michael Meyer who imagined his transformative opus that was unfolding through his alchemical work as this, what he called a journey through the planetary spheres, overcoming the binding power of the planetary archetypes. So again, this close connection between alchemy and astrology comes through in that course. I also teach a course in the third year, usually on synchronicity in the new sciences. And astrology is an example, as Jung said, it's an example of synchronicity on a grand scale. That there's a synchronistic correlation between where the planets are, something external, and what's happening archetypally in the psyche, something internal. So it's this kind of sustained cosmic synchronicity. And in that course, we look closely at Jung's formulation of his theory of synchronicity. We also study many new paradigm thinkers like David Bohm, the physicist Fritjof Capra, Rupert Sheldrake, and then cosmology and evolutionary theory, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And all these ideas inform a view of the universe in which astrology is more comprehensible. Because I think a lot of us, when we encounter astrology, think, you know, how on earth could it be that the planetary positions have any relationship to what I'm feeling inwardly or what I'm going through in the depths of my own experience? It seems incomprehensible because we're so used to thinking in kind of Cartesian causal terms as planets emitting forces that somehow influence us. Jung doesn't see it that way at all, and I think he's right. He did periodically entertain causal explanations of astrology, but by and large, he favored a synchronistic view, the idea that there's this acausal connection between where the planets are and what the archetypes are doing within the psyche. So that when I teach the synchronicity course, I assign my first book, which is called The Archetypal Cosmos, and it's really an attempt to try to think through systematically how it could be that planets are related to archetypes. How is the psyche related to the cosmos? And so I draw together Jungian psychology and these new paradigm scientific perspectives to try to articulate a worldview in which astrology makes more sense to us. Because I think that's one of the major obstacles that people have when they first consider astrology. You know, how is it that even possible? We're so conditioned to thinking in terms of quite rigid dichotomies between inner and outer that it's difficult to move beyond that. But that's what Jung did. Jung's theory of synchronicity challenged that kind of rigid dualism between inner and outer, between subject and the objective world. So I'm hastily summarizing some of these courses just to give you a sense for the way that ideas that are very central to archetypal cosmology are treated in the program. I think it's in the background in many courses, astrology, and it's explicit in those courses that I've mentioned. And some students in their dissertations are choosing to work on astrological themes. I'm going to be working with one student who's just begun, who's looking at major figures in rock music and their astrological charts. Promises to be an interesting piece of work. Susan Rowland, who's core faculty in the program, she a couple of years ago supervised a dissertation on astrology that was concerned with the moon's nodes. So some of you who know astrology may mean something to you. But I give these examples just to show you that Pacifica, the Jungian Archetypal Studies program, is a place where you might choose to bring in astrological research to your doctoral studies, to your dissertation writing. And it's done in a rigorous way. Obviously, Pacifica is one of very few places where you could do this kind of research. So you would benefit from the the kind of epistemological openness of those of us at Pacifica who are interested in these topics, but we do approach dissertation writing with rigor. So you'd have to be prepared to justify your use of astrology in your dissertation writing. So we're always trying to balance in the program critical rigor and a kind of creative openness to the imagination, to the depths of inner experience, to experiences that fall somewhat outside of the paradigmatic boundary lines of what is usually considered acceptable topics in academia. And virtually everything that Jung studied, from synchronicity to astrology to alchemy to parapsychology to mysticism, mystical experience, to polytheistic myths, all those things are in some sense beyond or on the margins of where mainstream academic thought is. And for that reason, it occupies a very important place that Jungian psychology and those of us in the field that are involved in Jungian studies are carrying forward something that the culture really needs, because it's excluded from the dominant mainstream focus. It's like a romanticism compensating for the dominant Enlightenment rational view, as it were. Like Jung's interest in the occult is it's an underlying current that carries forward an appreciation of the life of the spirit, of the soul, and that's obviously something that we sorely need in our time. So I'll end and turn over to questions if you have any. But just to reiterate really how valuable an archetypal understanding of astrology can be to illuminate the deeper patterns and dynamics of human experience, both individuals, particularly if you're involved in individuation, you're trying to grow psychologically, you're going through transformative experiences. Astrology can be very valuable then. So it can illuminate individual experience, and culturally, we live in a very turbulent times. And astrology can help us get some perspective on that, why we find ourselves in such chaos, and to perceive an order behind the chaos. I think that's a very helpful thing to have in our moment of history. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. I will turn it back over to Lee, and she will collate your questions and relay them to me.
Great, thank you so much. That was a great talk and great information about the program. As I mentioned before, please use the Zoom group chat window to submit questions. This is a great time to ask questions about anything Dr. LaGrace mentioned while he was talking, or about the program as well.
And I think just to say that the reason we're doing it through the chat box is that, chances are if you ask for questions and allow people to speak, everyone's going to speak at the same time, right? Either that or no one will speak. So we're hoping this way will allow people to articulate their questions if they have any, and send them to Lee through the chat. But if you really want to verbalize your question, that will be fine too. Any of you, could I ask, do any of you have any significant experience with astrology that maybe you'd like to comment on, or anyone who's curious but bewildered perhaps by astrology, which would be a very understandable starting point?
So we have a question from Daniel. It's a question. It says, this program appears to place an emphasis on astrology, and I'm wondering if there is a reading list available to which astrological texts are used in this course, if any.
There's not a reading list like that as such, because the main focus of the program is Jungian psychology and James Hillman. But those courses that I mentioned do feature major books in the field. There are extracts assigned from Cosmos and Psyche. So Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas. Tarnas, T-A-R-N-A-S, Cosmos and Psyche. And then my first book is called The Archetypal Cosmos. I assigned that in the Synchronicity and New Sciences course. Again, you could just Google that. We read pretty much all of that book in the Synchronicity course. Suggested reading for that course is my second book called Discovering Eris, which is about the synchronicities around the discovery of new planets, dwarf planets. Eris was a dwarf planet discovered in 2005-6. So there aren't actually many books in archetypal cosmology because the discipline is so new. As I mentioned, it really began when Richard Tarnas published Cosmos and Psyche in 2006, although its roots are ancient, right? Ancient astrology. Astrology goes back to 3,400 BCE. So it's ancient and modern together. But because the field's so new, there are only a handful of books that are really steeped in that archetypal perspective specifically. There are many books in psychological astrology written by informed Jungians. I've got a couple here. So Liz Green, many of you may have heard of Liz Green, she's the foremost psychological astrologer and a Jungian therapist. She wrote 2 books on Jung and astrology that came out last year. This one, The Astrological World of Jung's Liber Novus, the red book, published by Routledge, Taylor and Francis. And then a second one, like a companion volume, also by Liz Green, Jung's Studies in Astrology. So without intending to, 3 books came out at pretty much the same time. That one I co-edited with Saffron Rossi, a collection of Jung's writings on astrology. And then the 2 Liz Green books. I recommend all those. It's great to read Jung directly on astrology. So, because if you go to astrologers, you will get their interpretation of Jung, which often is helpful, but it's always good to go to the primary source. And then, what did Jung himself actually say on the topic? So that was one of the motivations Saffron and I had when we were working to put together that book, to allow Jung to speak for himself by gathering all his various reflections on astrology into one place. So so that book also appears on the syllabus. Looks like there's a couple more comments and questions coming through.
Sure. There's one from Patricia. She wanted to confirm that the courses, the courses that you mentioned were included in the program.
Yes, yeah. Simple answer, yes, that they are. The way that the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program works, and we call it DJA for shorthand. D is depth psychology, and JA, Jungian and Archetypal Studies. So in the DJA program, there are no electives. You do every course. Every student does every course. It's a cohort model. So you join a cohort, and as long as you don't take a leave of absence or anything like that, you would just stay with the cohort one quarter after the next, and you would do all the courses. So yeah, everything that's there on the website you will take.
Great, thank you. Another one from Lee. I've been looking at astrology for some time now, but always wondered how the connection would be towards the psyche and how it would impact us. I found that there is a connection, but wasn't sure how that could be. From what you said, it makes a lot more sense to me now. Your explanation is a lot more grounded than other explanations I've heard. I'm interested in the individuation process, and I was wondering if you think that the process can be completed, and if so, some examples of our history where someone has and why. Thank you.
Well, I will refer to Jung, who said really that individuation never ends, that it's an ideal, because, I mean, it's a complicated answer, I suppose, but I'll try. So Jung believed that there's always a tension between consciousness, the ego. So when I say ego, I mean like the I principle. If you say I, you're referencing your ego. There's a tension between consciousness and your individual will and the unconscious. And individuation is about bringing those 2 psychic systems into closer alignment, coming to terms with the unconscious. But Jung thought that could never happen completely. There always has to be some tension. You're never going to be so aligned with the deep psyche and the nature of things, that you never your will never deviates from the will of the self and the will of the larger psyche. There's always going to be some discrepancy, and there has to be in Jung's view, because that tension is the basis of self-reflective awareness. That's it. It's a complicated answer, but that's Jung's view. But clearly, you can make progress on individuation. Are there examples in history? Jung held Goethe in high esteem. Jung himself, obviously, is a good example of someone who seems to have individuated to a high degree. So if you read Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, you'll see the changes in Jung throughout his life. He, by and large, was more heroic, Herculean, confronting the unconscious in a heroic manner earlier in his life, up through his late 30s, perhaps. And then if you read the stuff from Jung's late reflections, when he's in his 70s into his early 80s, he's far more Taoist. He's more like attuned to nature. He's returned to simplicity. You get the sense of a reconnection to nature and a return to something like a unified whole existence. But that will be an interesting study, actually, looking at people who you think exemplify models of people who have made significant progress in their own individuation process. Great question.
Awesome. Next one from Dr. Bob. Can you say something on the different path that a student at Pacifica will venture on, and kind of mentioning what that would look like for someone pursuing a counseling psychology path, and then what does the student typically need to attain his or her licensure?
Okay, well, something we often reiterate when applicants come through in the program: this is not a program that leads to licensure. It's which is its strength in many ways, because we're concerned with the academic study of Jung, the application to individual experience and to culture, but outside of the therapeutic encounter. That's the ethos, the rationale for the program. But that said, many counselors and therapists do come into the program. Sometimes their basic training has been in another approach, in Gestalt or CPT or whatever it might be, and they want to assimilate more deeply a Jungian perspective and bring that through in their therapeutic work. So people do use it in that way, and we get a lot of therapists come to the program. We get artists, people interested in creativity. There are people who see themselves on a more, I wouldn't say traditional academic path, but they want to teach, they want to write. And then some people are in established careers that are not necessarily related to depth psychology, but they're looking for the personal enrichment, or they're looking to bring in Jungian ideas in some way to their work, if possible. So there's a whole range of different people and different paths that bring people into the program and on which they follow as they leave. Increasingly, we're getting more and more dissertation students now finishing their work. They're defending their dissertations. They're going out into the world, because the program is quite new. It only came into existence in 2010. So this is we're in our 9th year. But each year now we get more and more dissertation students finish, and they're taking their ideas out to the world in creative ways and finding their unique path. It's kind of in the nature of following the self, the deeper psyche, that there's not always a set path. Like you just have to walk one step at a time, and it's that kind of moving beyond that rational, strategic mindset that we all have. We're trying to figure out how best to live and how we're going to achieve our goals. But when you're dealing with the unconscious, there's a shift to a more receptive, dialogical, what does the psyche want me to do? What does the self want me to do? And that only tends to be revealed progressively, step by step. And then that obviously feeds into your vocation, because your vocation, your career from that, if you're living in a deep way, tends to come out of what the self has in mind for you. It's like a deeper dimension of your individuality and personality itself. And so rather than live according to the ego and figure out what is the best career to make the most money, or to be most successful, these are important things, but rather than live that way exclusively, if you're trying to individuate, and the idea is then that you open yourself to the greater order that's coming through the psyche. And so your career path, your vocational path, goes hand in hand with your commitment to understanding the depths of the psyche. And it's very good in that respect of helping people understand that. We'd all like more guarantees of definite careers that were down the line, but if you place your trust in the self and you try to actualize what it is that the self wants you to do, that can lead you to a meaningful life, and that's really as important as anything, I would say. So great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I, from Corinne, thank you. Can I ask what the difference between the psyche and the collective unconscious is?
Okay, yeah, great clarifying question. So the psyche for Jung is the totality of psychological experience, and Jung said that all our experience is psychological, right? You can't have an experience that's not psychological, because you're just constantly conscious of a perception or a sensation or a memory or urge or your will and so forth. Everything's psychological. But the collective unconscious is a dimension or a layer of the psyche of which we're ordinarily not aware. Most people, Jung believed, have no awareness of the unconscious. That's why he called it the unconscious. I mean, it came from Freud and others, but that's what the word implies. So the collective unconscious is our shared collective psychology, which comprises, in Jung's view, the archetypes and the instincts. They're closely connected. So shadow, anima and animus, trickster, wise old man, self, Dionysus, hero, all these things are patterns and powers within each of us. We each feel heroic in some sense. We're each dealing with our sore point in some sense, our inferiority. That's the shadow, right? If you have an urge to care for the world, that coming out of the Great Mother, like you want to eliminate the sorrows and the sufferings of the world. All these archetypes are universal aspects of our psychology. And Jung found that we have the tendency to fall into patterns of compulsive possession is a strong word, but a certain compulsive patterns. So the archetypes kind of run the show, and we're not even aware of it. So that one of the aims of depth psychology is to become more conscious of how the archetypes are coming through. So that's the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious contains the archetypes. It's a deep layer in your psyche, in my psyche. And Jung also thought that, in his later reflections especially, that the collective unconscious is kind of the ground of everything. It connects, it merges into this, an underlying, what he used the term the unus mundus, like one world. It comes out of the Hermetic tradition, alchemy, a unified background dimension of our reality. So the collective unconscious is like this deep layer of the psyche, and even beyond the psyche in some sense. Okay.
Awesome. Regarding the correlation between each planet and a specific archetype, would it follow that when that planet is in retrograde, the shadow of that archetype would be active?
I haven't found that to be the case, no. Retrograde, for those of you who don't know, it takes a feat of visualization, but we're on Earth and we're orbiting the sun, and other planets are orbiting the sun at different speeds. So from our perspective on Earth, it sometimes appears that against the frame of the zodiac, that certain planets appear to move backwards. That's retrograde motion. So normally planets will be moving forwards, direct motion, but sometimes because of the relative speed of the Earth to the other planets, it appears that some planets move backwards. I haven't found that to be indicative of shadow expressions of shadow, you can get shadow expressions of any archetype, I think, at any time. Retrograde motion, at least what I've observed, tends to be when you kind of revisit a theme that's, you know, if you've got a theme that's an archetypal theme that's constellated in your life, and then the planet goes backwards, retrograde, it's almost like a revisiting that theme, and then it goes forward again, and you revisit the theme again. You know, if we had more time, I could give you examples, but that's a short way of saying no. I don't think retrograde motion is associated with shadow expression, because you get shadow expressions with all archetypes. Like Pluto can be blind, instinctual compulsion, power drives, a dominating will, but it can also be passionate commitment to something, or the capacity to undergo profound transformation and rebirth experiences. And normally with these archetypes, both negative and positive are constellated at the same time. The archetypes don't seem to be inherently good or bad. Like, human beings bring those moral categories and judgments to the archetypes, and how would you say what's good and what's bad? Sometimes it's a little ambiguous. So the general point being that archetypes all have their positive and negative manifestations, and part of the work of astrology and depth psychology is how we deal with these archetypes when they manifest. And the more conscious we can be, the less likely we are to fall into blind patterns and destructive behaviors that we would like to avoid. That's the general aim. Thank you.
Are you okay with doing a few more?
Yeah, let's just keep going. Great. These are great questions.
Is it possible to go to the DJA program part-time?
Initially, no. When everyone comes in, it's a full-time program. So you have to take two courses each quarter, 4 quarters a year. So you're doing 8 courses a year. But sometimes, as you can imagine, people enter the program and then life happens, right? And unexpected things arise. And there is a means for you to go part-time if you file a formal petition to Pacifica's, what we call the Education Council. It's a body that makes academic decisions. And if you've got good reason, then chances are the Education Council will grant your request and allow you to go part-time for 1 quarter, 2 quarters perhaps. It's not usually an indefinite arrangement, but that provision is there. But when you come in, we're looking for a full-time commitment. It's a 3 years of coursework anyway, plus 2 years dissertation. So it's already a long road if you're doing full-time. But if you go in half-time, you know, if you do half-time the whole program, if you can't, that would be obviously 6 years coursework and then 2 years or more dissertation writing. Extremely long period of time. So it's full-time program. You can take a leave of absence too. So again, you would request a leave of absence, and you might take a quarter off and resume the following quarter. So there are ways to manage a heavy workload. That's the key thing.
Thank you. Another question from Greg, thank you. You had mentioned that the psyche's connection and integration with the cosmos is primarily viewed in regards to planetary positioning. However, I've also been impressed with our biological response, such as the movement of bodies of water through the tides in relation to moon phases. I've witnessed clear behavioral reactions in groups, such as when working in vocational rehab sheltered workshops, where prior to interventions being put into place, would regularly cause unruly food fights in the lunch cafeteria. Sun flares also reportedly cause unexplained behavior shifts in many people. Is planetary positioning mainly related to archetypal influence?
Well, I mean, in those examples, it's not clear whether it's a causal connection. Is it because some astronomical phenomena causes a change in the human psyche, or are we meaningfully connected to the happenings in outer space in some way, and so that it's synchronistic, that it's, as Jung would say, acausal? I mean, it could be both. It's not necessarily one or the other. But yeah, I mean, one of the main objections to astrology is Carl Sagan. You know, he produced that book and TV series Cosmos years ago. He made the point that the gravitational force of the doctor or the midwife at birth is stronger than any planet. So if you're trying to account for through gravity, some kind of gravitational force, how a planet might influence you physically, and therefore as a basis of astrology, that's easily debunked by scientists. And in fact, in terms of the 4 known forces in science, gravity, the strong and the weak, nuclear forces, and electromagnetism, none of them can be used to satisfactorily account for changes in human experience. So it makes causal explanations difficult. And I myself just find synchronistic line of explanation more persuasive. But you know, people have different views in respect of astrology. But I think the key thing that comes out of many new paradigm scientific perspectives and also depth psychology is this idea of interconnectedness, that you know we've lived under the scientific paradigm of atomistic reductionism for a long time, and it's delivered tremendous advances in science and technology. But you know, if you see the world in terms of discrete interacting parts that they're only connected through forces, and they're basically separate, and that's a whole different view and a whole different way of seeing life than if you have a recognition of the unity of things, that we are not separate ultimately from nature, from each other, from the heavens are not ultimately separate from the events on earth, but they're all part of a single unitary reality. And it's kind of obvious when you say that there's only one reality, there's only, you know, we're all in it, and there are no hard and fast divisions in our experience. Yet somehow, because of the Cartesian Newtonian scientific view, we come to construe the world in terms of this interaction of basically separate parts. So I think a key recognition that comes out of Jung, particularly later Jung, synchronicity Jung, and other cognate disciplines, is this a recognition and a return to a view of the interconnectedness and unity of things. And I think that's so important in our time. Thank you.
Awesome. That's the last question. We had someone share that they had been studying a newer system called Human Design, which combines the I Ching, Kabbalah, rave energy system. And
well, you mean Jung wrote actually used the I Ching and the I Ching. That was kind of an introduction in some ways to synchronicity. The monograph Jung wrote on synchronicity contains a discussion of the I Ching. So that's another example of an interest outside of the what is usually accepted divination. He was very interested in divination.
Awesome. Oh, there's one new question. A big thank you for your time and presentation.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's always a pleasure to talk about these topics, and I hope it's been informative for everyone with an interest in the program. As Lee mentioned, she'd happily answer any admissions questions you may have, and if you've got any more questions about the program, Lee can direct those questions to me, and I can do my best to answer. So things may come up after this that you weren't able to put the questions to me here and now, but you might think of something later on. So by all means, if you've got a question on the program, on the course content, I'll do my best, or another faculty member will do their best to help you give you an answer to those questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for being here and for your great questions, which expanded on the topic.